Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're very pleased to welcome Sue Farmer of Miradorus Limited, who is here today to deliver this session on communication skills, or perhaps more importantly, the problems faced with miscommunication. Before I hand you over to her, I just wanted to mention a few things. Firstly, for those of you who haven't attended one of our IOSH webinars, I am Ben Pollard and I take care of the technical aspects of these sessions. Any problems, and I will try to assist as best as I can. On your screen, most likely located at the top left-hand side, you'll notice a small bar with some written options on them, which are chat and Q&A. If you have any technical issues and need to message me at any point, please use the chat option. If you have any specific questions for Sue relating to the content of the session, please use the Q&A option and ask your questions here. You can open and minimize these boxes at your own leisure, and should a message be sent out to you, it will flash orange on your screen. So with all that said, I shall now hand you over to Sue and hope you all enjoy the session.
Thank you very much for that, Ben. Nice introduction there. Sue Farmer, I work for Miradorus, and I spend most of my life working with all types of organisations, helping them overcome some of the chaos and conflict that happens when we just don't get communication right. And by way of background, I started life as a consultant, primarily working with the IT community, doing some really interesting projects across the UK, probably mainly financial services focused. I pretty soon figured out that actually it wasn't about technology, it wasn't about process re-engineering, it was all about the people. And if we were ever going to deliver successfully, then actually what we really needed to do was get people to communicate effectively. And technology's moved on, but alas, unfortunately, we still encounter human communication issues. I think it probably is useful to know that not only do I utilize tools like the whole brain thinking profiling tool, which we're going to talk about today, but I'm also a trained hypnotherapist, NLP, and a number of other support tools sit in my tool bag. So much of the conversation today will be utilizing all of those tools so that we actually have some ways and some methods and some techniques that can help us with this. So let's get started, I think, Ben. That's enough about me.
Okay, so we are going to kick off then with a couple of questions. Obviously, we want to try and keep this as interactive as possible, so put your questions through and we can ask them. The first question here that I personally would like to know is, obviously, really, we all communicate all of the time, and it's something we've had plenty of practice with, in fact, since before we even went to school, really. So just why is it such a key topic?
That's a really good question. Thanks for that, Ben. Communication is such a key topic because no matter how good we are from a business or a home life perspective, we are still so reliant on communication to get anything done. And of course, yes, we all start communicating at a really young age. So as soon as we are born, we're actually starting to communicate, not necessarily verbally. But us humans, you know, we're very good at understanding communication that's non-verbal as well as verbal. But what gets in our way, particularly as we get older, are things like mood. Our mood is continually up for grabs. You know, we may leave the house with a great mood, and by the time we get to work, we're in a really low mood. And that definitely impacts how we communicate. That starts to drive things like what assumptions that we make. And also, what do we hear? Are we hearing what the person actually said, or what we think they said? And so often chaos and conflict comes from a bit of that miscommunication. So to my mind, it probably is more important than anything else that we have operating in business and in the family life at the moment. If you think about it from a health, safety and well-being perspective, it is absolutely vital that people hear the message. And yet, if some of those mood assumptions or almost muffled hearing is getting in the way, then we cannot be sure what they're hearing. And we see the outcome of that all of the time, unfortunately.
Okay, so that does make sense, and I do get why it is a key topic. So really, what would you say, what is communication?
Well, actually, it's very simple. We really only have three elements to get our head around. The first element is questioning. So that's a key participant of communication. And I'm sure many of you have been on communication and questioning courses over the years, and they'll have come up with all sorts of different types of questioning. But actually there really is only two that we need to think about. One is open questions, and the other one is closed questions. Open questions to find out more, closed questions to confirm the next step. Now, what often happens is that we make a few assumptions, we get tied up in our own thinking. So we ask the first question, but rather than really being present and listening, because we have busy heads and all sorts of other things going on in our life, we start to think about the second question while the person has just begun to answer the first question. And because of the way assumptions work, we'll hear the first 2 or 3 words and then we make the rest of it up. And the focus is very much on, so what am I going to ask next? And it's where the miscommunication comes in, because I didn't really listen. So we've got the open and closed questions, and we know that because of assumptions, we move from very much open questions to closed questions very quickly. Or we do that wonderful thing and we ask somebody, so do you understand the new policy that we've just implemented? And then we leave it for about 10 seconds and it's almost as though the silence is too scary and we start to answer it ourselves. Well, I'm sure you do understand it, but if you'd like to know more, then we could either talk about this or we could talk about that. And so we hone it down, so we just shut people out. And certain types of people, because we're all very different, will just disengage at that point. Others will feel very vulnerable and attempt to come in but just be pushed out. So that whole questioning thing, we really need to come at from a very open perspective. And then we move to listening. How good are we really at listening? So whilst I completely accept that the responsibility to get the message across wholly lies with the person who's communicating, whether they're communicating in writing or whether they're communicating verbally, we really do need to make sure that we're actively listening, not thinking about something else. You know, the brain doesn't really multitask. That's just one of those fables that we learn to accept and run with. It doesn't multitask, and so therefore it dips in and out and we end up with black holes, or rather we end up with assumptions. So what we thought we heard may not be what we really heard. And so we really need to check that we're present and we are listening, and that those assumptions and those preconceived ideas are just not getting in our way at that point in time. Plenty of time after the conversation to reflect on that. And then the only other element that we have from a communication point of view when we've dealt with questioning and listening is informing. And again, with informing, we need to make sure that the person is understanding. So we need to come back to our questioning skills and check in with them and make sure they really did understand what we were trying to communicate to them, and then listen very carefully to their answer. So that means we need to take into consideration, is this a good time to communicate with you? Do you have time to stop and listen to me? Or are you really tied up with something urgent at the moment, in which case you're probably not going to hear me? Am I using the correct medium? For some people, written word is really effective. For other people, I need to have a conversation with them. I can't just treat everybody as one person, because we're all unique individuals. We all have a unique experience of the world on a day-to-day basis. And we also need to think about, where are we going to do the communication? If we're doing it face-to-face, does it need to be one-on-one? Does it need to be in a big room with everybody there? And does everybody need to be there? Because if it's not relevant, then they're going to start to be disruptive. And there's a high chance that the people that need to hear the communication are distracted by the people who don't want to hear or where it's not relevant to them. So just recapping slightly, we really have responsibility for message clarity. And we also have responsibility for clear listening. And most importantly of all, we need to learn to stay present. And that's a bit of a skill that we need to practice. And why is that so important? Well, we need to just step back a little bit and have a look at how the brain really works. We know that we have a conscious and a subconscious mind. And it's the conscious mind that all too often gets in our way, driven from a point of innocence because the intention is really positive. Well, I'm going to assume that the intention is really positive. But we really need to understand that our conscious mind at any one point in time will hold somewhere between 5 and 9 thoughts, 5 and 9 assumptions, 5 and 9 points of view. While our subconscious mind, which is where the wisdom is and where we really need to be open to listen to things, will hold somewhere between 60 and 90,000 thoughts in a day. So we can see we really are just getting a subset when we're just listening with our conscious mind. And why does the conscious mind get in our way? Well, when we present a new idea or when we come up with some information that perhaps I as an individual don't agree with, I'm going to take it away and have a chat with myself. That in-head chatterbox that we all have. And by the way, we all do have it. And the reason we have that in-head chatterbox is without it, language doesn't make sense to us. We need it to translate the words and the tone into something that we can understand internally. And so that chatterbox has a big role, but we want to make sure that it doesn't come in too early. So therefore, when somebody presents a new idea and we're being run by our conscious mind, what happens is we have a little chat with ourselves about it. Do I agree with that? Do I think she really knows what she's talking about? The last time I had a conversation with her, this happened or that happened. Or yeah, they're always a good person, so it's really worth listening to this person. In that time that we have that conversation with ourselves, whether it's positive or disruptive, we stop listening. And therefore we start to get some assumptions just about what was being said. And we get on the road to miscommunication, chaos, or even conflict. There's another element in all of this as well. And that is that it's not just about giving me the data. Whether we're asking questions or whether we're providing information, we need to make sure that we go beyond the what. The important thing is that if we just sit at the what, if I just tell you that I want to talk to you later, then I cannot guarantee that the intention associated with my communication is aligned to the effect. Because what I want to get out of the communication may not be what's going on in your head. Now, why is that? The reason behind that is because as human beings, we are all naturally curious. We want to know why. If you want to see me at 5 o'clock today, I want to know why. Now go back to where I started when I was talking about the fact that our mood is always up for grabs. What I mean by that point is if I'm in a high mood and I think you want to see me at 5 o'clock, I'm going to make up the why, and I might make up a positive why. However, if I'm in a low mood, or my journey to work has been bad and I've decided it's going to be a bad day, then I'm going to think potentially that the reason you want to see me at 5 o'clock is because something's gone wrong. Or you want to tell me off about something, or you want to moan about something, or you want to give me more work to do. In any event, by the time I come to see you at 5 o'clock, my head is full of what the outcome's going to be, long before you've opened your mouth. And therefore, the chances of me even beginning to hear any of the communication that you have to deliver to me is so limited, because I've got the story running in my head. So when we're communicating and we want to ensure that intent and effect is aligned, we need to not only say what it is we want to say, but why as well. So we prevent the storytelling, we prevent making up in innocence whatever it is that we're going to talk about later. But it doesn't stop there, because what and why is not enough for curious human beings. The next stage in this is the facts and the feelings. So really, when we're having a communication, and this really only does take another 10, 20 seconds, we need to make sure we've got the what covered. We need to make sure we've got some data or some facts to support the what. For some people, that's really critical. We certainly need to tell people why. Why are we asking them questions? Why are we giving them information? Because otherwise they will make it up. And we also need to take into account their feelings. Some of the information we may be passing on may make people feel really good. They may take away some really positive elements from it. But just imagine for a second that we're talking about an office relocation, for example. It may mean an extra half hour in bed for some people. And for others, it may mean an extra 2-hour journey to work. So we can't just assume that everybody's going to feel great about whatever it is we're talking about. So we need to anticipate that. And we need to give time in communication to not only deliver the what and the facts and the why, but also understand the feelings and allow time for that to be communicated. And it's only at that point can we be sure that we've done everything that we need to do to get intent and effect aligned, because we are all different. And if we try and treat us all the same, knowing that we all have unique brains, like we have unique fingerprints, then we're never going to get to the outcome that we're looking for. Do we have any questions about that at all at the moment, Ben?
We've got a few questions that have come in. I'm going to go through these as they come in. And the first one that I do have actually is someone has said that our teams receive so many communications every day through emails, newsletters, workshops, etc., etc. So what tips would you have for making written communications really stand out?
So from a written perspective, we're going to cover that when we start to look at the different types of people and the way we think and just the impact that it has. But not to sidestep that question at all, because I do want to hold it and come back and address it, particularly in the sum up area. But one of the things that we know with emails and with newsletters is that when people write and when people communicate, because of the way that the human works, and much of this we've just forgotten, we write and communicate with tone. We also read with tone. However, when we're writing it, we cannot control the tone that people read with. So therefore, when we're doing that, what I would call kind of general sheep dip kind of communication, we need to take extra care with the words that we use, because we cannot guarantee exactly how people are going to read it. What I might read as really positive, Ben, you may read as really negative, because our moods are different and we're unique individuals. So we need to take that into account. And the less general, one-size-fits-all type communication we do, the better. The more effectively and the better it's likely to land. And therefore, the more likely I am to read it. Communication has just become one of those things that we just do all the time. And by the way, we've accepted it. And we don't need to accept it. We need to think about it a little bit more.
Okay, we've got another one here, which is with regards to obviously comes back to listening, and that is what advice would you give to people who simply don't want to listen?
Well, when we're coming across don't want to listen, my first question is, how do you know they don't want to listen? That sounds like a whacking assumption to me. And if we are finding that there is a barrier to listening, it's not about how do I bulldoze my way through that barrier. We need to think about what is getting in their way. So actually, rather than just demanding more listening, maybe it's time for us to do a bit of listening. Ask a few questions. This doesn't seem to be landing with you too clearly. How can I help you understand this? What's getting in the way here? I'm really curious. It doesn't seem as though you can hear exactly what I'm saying. Help me understand how I can communicate with you more effectively. It's very important that we take that responsibility when we're communicating, which means sometimes we have to stop and listen ourselves.
Okay, that's interesting. And when you have a multicultural audience, how would you tailor messages like that?
And that's really an interesting question. And for that, what I'd like to do is move to our next slide, because what our next slide talks about actually is whether we're talking multicultural or any kind of diversity, in fact, we need to start from a point of understanding that all of our brains are unique. Like our fingerprints, there are no two brains in the world that are identical. I happen to be blessed with identical twins, and let me assure you, their brains are very different in the way they operate and where their preferences are. And the model that we're looking at here is the Herman brain dominance model, which looks for thinking preferences. Now, they don't define us. It doesn't talk about competence or capability, but it does talk about preference. Now, I happen to be right-handed, so therefore, when I've got something to write, I will automatically pick up a pencil with my right hand or a pen with my right hand because it feels comfortable. When we start thinking about thinking preferences in particular, then when people are presented with a question or some information, then the way they hear and the way they take that information in is very largely dominated by their thinking preference because it feels comfortable. Now, it doesn't mean to say they can't do the others, because that's not how it works. Because, of course, you know, we have a whole brain unless we're unfortunate enough to have something medically wrong with our brain, and therefore we have access to all 4 of the quadrants in the brain. But we go to where we're comfortable. And then when we put some pressure on it, we go to where we're most comfortable under pressure. And they all look really different. So rather than being tied up with, well, they're from a different culture or English is not their first language, we need to step beyond some of those lower level elements and come back to the fact that all human beings have unique brains and we all have thinking preferences. We all have dominance in our thinking in the same way as we have dominance in our body. And when we're looking at that dominance, as you can see from the picture in front of you, when we're looking at that left mode, then we're looking at more logical, analytical, measured, data-driven type thinking. Now, those kind of guys, they're looking for accuracy. In fact, there may or may not be, there may or may not be numbers included in this. They have a preference for numbers, and it's going to sit in that left blue mode, that A quadrant mode. And therefore, when we're looking to gain trust, and trust is one of the routes into listening, we need to make sure either we're accurate in the data we provide them, or we tell them that we're not sure, rather than just make it up. Because one of the traits that is very common with someone who has got that logical, analytical preference based in their thinking is that they'll go off and check. And if they go off and check and it's not correct, well then actually, because this quadrant is very driven by efficiency, it's just going to dismiss you and therefore not trust you in the future, and perhaps not even deal with you. Now, when they communicate, it tends to be fairly blunt and direct and to the point. It's not that it's not keen on people or detail, it's just that it doesn't see the purpose of it. If there's purpose, it'll put it in there, but most of the time, it just wants to get from A to B as efficiently as possible, which means they may not consider verbal communication unless they're sure the person they're going to talk to is available at that point in time. And if they're going to use written communication, it is going to be short and to the point. It may not have hi so, because their reasoning behind that was, you know, so you know who you are, the emails come to you, I don't need to address you by name twice. I may not agree with that, but with positive intent, they're looking to communicate with me effectively and efficiently. Whereas if we're looking at that green quadrant, still on the left side of the brain, this is all about compliance, doing what I need to do when I said I was going to do it. So I need to be planned and organized. If I'm going to deliver reliability, then I need lots of detail in order to be sure that I get there. And when we're starting to think about, well, you know, someone from a green quadrant, if we want them to listen, how are we going to build trust with them? Well, then we very much need to make sure that we deliver what we say we're going to do when we said we're going to do it. Time's really important to these guys. Things like grammar and spelling are also really important to these guys. So if we're communicating with them, not only do we need to make sure there is sufficient detail in there so that they understand whatever it is that we're trying to communicate very clearly, no ambiguity, no risk, because that will make them uncomfortable. And why would we want to do that? But we also need to make sure that it's timely and that there is structure around it. Reliability doesn't come from chance. Reliability to these guys comes from the fact that I've planned it and detailed it and ordered it. I understand it, and therefore there is no risk. But again, we could have somebody that's got some red quadrant preference. And in that red quadrant, that's the interpersonal element. And they're not only using written and verbal skills here. They're often very in touch with what we now call intuition. Intuition is one of those words that kind of sprung up because we couldn't find another word for it. We've lost touch with the fact that actually 55% of our communication comes from body language. We just forget about this stuff. We also forget about the fact that tone, as I mentioned earlier, has a key role in communication. 38% of human communication happens on tonality. So that leaves us with 7% for the words. So when someone who has more of an interpersonal feeling-based or more emotional thinking preference, they absolutely want to do face-to-face. And if they're doing any other kind of communication, they're going to want to make sure that they have put enough of the empathetic words in there. So if they're communicating and they can't communicate face-to-face, they're probably going to want to follow with a telephone call if they're forced into a writing form of communication. They want to check in. They want to hear tonality. Where possible, they want to see body language, so they'll often opt for Zoom or Skype or something where there is AV availability for them, because it's very key. You know, when people first meet each other, there's some really interesting science behind this. The first thing we do when we look face to face is subconsciously, here comes that subconscious wisdom coming to the fore again, we will notice how people's pupils change. The amount of change in the size of a pupil very much depends on whether we feel affinity and connectedness with that person. Now, we are not consciously aware of this. We can't go around and look at each other's pupils and see the difference. We are subconsciously aware. So we're already beginning to set ourselves up with some ideas about how the communication is going to go long before we even start. And that's really key to these people, because it's that intuition. Is there alignment between body language, tonality, and the words that I'm using that allows me to trust you? And that's key, again, when we're thinking about communication. And by the way, all communication comes from the right quadrant, from this right brain. That's where it's driven from. We use left brain elements, but it starts from the right brain. And then we've also got that big picture, yellow, holistic quadrant sitting up there. These are the guys that like the freedom to explore, and therefore when we're communicating or building trust with them, we need to allow them to ideate, come up with innovation, come up with their ideas before we shut them down and start holding them to delivery dates or firm outcomes. And we need to be aware that sometimes when these guys communicate, because they're still ideating, their communication becomes a little bit disjointed, because their thinking hasn't settled, and therefore we need to allow them the freedom to explore. So actually, rather than being tied up in culture or where I come from or primary language, we need to be thinking about where's their preferences, what can I see, what clues can I spot, and therefore how can I address them.
It's quite interesting, I mean, because obviously in some circumstances, there's not always, you don't always have the time to establish that. And in fact, there is a question here that many construction projects are carried out by a very transient workforce who you don't always have time to establish these thinking preferences with, or your audience, they're more difficult. They don't necessarily have English as their first language. So how do you communicate effectively on that basis?
Well, that's a very interesting comment about I don't have the time. Because if we don't have the time to communicate properly, that says we have the time to communicate badly and then put it right. So I would very much dispute this whole time piece. And whether we're talking construction or any other part of commerciality, or even indeed in the home base, if the communication is important enough that the other person understands exactly what we've got to say, then I would suggest that making the time becomes non-optional. And we're not talking about a lot of time. So whether we're talking about a little bit of communication, so we're looking for clues on their thinking preference, and if we can't detect it while we're in the practice period, it takes a while to learn this stuff, then we need to make sure that we have the data, that we have enough detail, that we are doing the interpersonal element, and that we are allowing for freedom until it becomes apparent where the preferences are, supported by that what, why, facts and feelings. If we don't do that, then can we communicate? Sure we can. But all we do is run the risk of miscommunication. And miscommunication just kicks off assumptions, because we don't know what the other person is thinking. We don't know what mood they're in. We don't know what listening filters they have. And if we just talk at them rather than to them, we just carry on the whole set of communication issues that we currently are experiencing now. And it's where so much conflict and so many issues and accidents and errors at work come from, if but they took the time to understand the importance of communication.
I think this has possibly been covered along the way a little bit, but someone has asked, how do you feel local dialect affects communication when communicating, and which accents are better or worse?
Again, you know, we're up against some unconscious bias here. And depending on the rules and the labels that we've acquired over the years will depend on how we view these things. I would suggest there isn't a better or worse. We just need to have that honest, open communication. And when we don't hear, rather than making assumptions or making it up, we just need to be honest. There seems to be this fear that if I'm speaking to somebody who has a different accent from me and I don't understand what they say, I can't ask. Whatever happened to giving the person enough respect to value what they're saying and really listen properly and start by saying, I really didn't understand that. I mean, let's be honest, English language is or any language indeed, is really interesting because our mood can impact us so greatly. You know, let me give you quite a light-hearted example. I was doing the crossword at home the other evening with my husband, and my head was a bit all over the place thinking about all sorts of stuff that had been going on in my day. And he was reading clues out to me, and I was kind of half-heartedly listening. And one of the clues that he read out to me is, a run in stockings. And in my head, I had somebody with stockings over their head about to rob a bank. And so I was answering with things like, you know, theft, delusion, illusion. And he's looking at me and he said, no, it's a ladder. And I did this whole about turn, and it was such a simple communication and it had no lasting impact. But it could have been really critical. And it could have been just that my head was in the wrong place and I heard the right words, but I put them together the wrong way in my head. And that's where that open questioning comes in. Are we really hearing the same thing? Or actually are they busy-headed and making some assumptions? You know, we all create our own map of the world. And unless we understand that, then it can be really, really challenging to see if we're on the same page. So I'm showing you here something that probably many of you recognize as a pretty standard map of the world. I'm fortunate enough to work around the globe. And I love to show this map, which has got the UK right in the middle, something that those of us that were born in the UK recognise, we use as a benchmark. But you take this to the USA, and their standard map of the world doesn't look like this. In fact, Europe and Africa kind of get compressed a little bit and shunted over. And unsurprisingly, the US moves into far more of a central role. And I have seen many maps where the US landmass has increased by about 20%. Now, who am I to say that my map is right and their map is wrong? But that's something that we take as a benchmark, as a given, and yet they look differently. But imagine that I'm talking about my UK map with somebody who sees this map of the world. Suddenly the perspectives are very different. Now, we're not stressed, we're not making assumptions, we just have some different benchmark starting points. And we are going to be on completely different standings if we haven't done that check-in. If we're not checking that we see the world from an Australian perspective or a UK perspective. We're not about upside down, inside out, right or wrong here. It's just about valuing that diversity and the difference. Because if we can look at communication from all perspectives, get feedback from all perspectives, then we're far more likely to get our communication right. And we're much less likely to make assumptions. You know, because we rely on assumptions so much. They are so important. And yet sometimes we get them wrong, and it's really, really important that we check on assumptions. Now, the brain has designed itself to shortcut so much of what we do. So those of you who are listening to this webinar that are wearing trousers, I guarantee you led with the same leg this morning that you will lead with tomorrow, that you led with yesterday, because you've got a shortcut in the brain. But those shortcuts can lead to unintentional blindness. And we are not even aware most of the time that we're making assumptions. We're talking from a tried and tested perspective that we believe to be true. The innocence in all of this is that we don't know that we need to question this. And therefore, when we don't question it, we can get ourselves into trouble. And in the workplace, or when we're talking about health, safety, or well-being, we can get ourselves into some serious trouble, because when we start to see things, we will start to make instant assumptions. So you look at this slide, for example, and it looks like it says good times are here. But of course, it doesn't say that. It says nonsense. But because it looked like it said good times are here, then we believe that's what it says. And then we don't stop and question, we just go on with that assumption. Now, we might delve a little bit deeper if we've got a bit of a green thinking preference. But if we've got a yellow thinking preference, we've probably forgotten about this altogether and moved on to the next idea, taking that as a decision that's just been confirmed. So assumptions really have a key metric in all of this. The other element that we need to think about, and we often are unaware of that, is that the whole bane of the human world at the moment, and that's stress. You know, when we think back to when they were discovering the value of vitamin C on ships, for 500 years it was okay, or not okay, expected even, that if you went on a ship there was a high chance you were going to die of scurvy. And some of those early cruises, so people like Magellan, who were off looking around the world, he started his trip, first of all, with something like 236 people, and over 200 of them died from scurvy during that trip. And that was it just was. Now, they'd started using limes on some trips and noticed that it had an impact, but they didn't make the connection between the lime and the scurvy, and we just accepted it. Stress has become a bit like that. But of course, it impacts hugely on communication, because we're busy blaming other people for stress, but we make it up because we really don't get how our brain, our equipment is working in the business environment or the home environment, never mind how other people's are. And we really need to take a step back and say, okay, let's look at what do I know to be true about this matter. So for example, if I was to show you a picture and then ask you to all write down exactly what do you see happening now? What do you think happened just before this? What do you think will happen next? We could have every answer from people being late to work, to the female being under attack from the male, to the female having just robbed the male, and many, many other options alongside those. But of course, what we're doing there is making assumptions. We're making it up. And we tend to find that when stress kicks in, particularly with communication, our ability to hear just goes out of the window. Do we have any other questions that are coming in that we need to address right now, Ben, that you think would be useful?
We do have another question that came in a short while ago. Basically, have you seen any organisations who communicate and engage with their employees brilliantly? And if so, can you share what was so brilliant about it?
Questions like that are very difficult to answer, as you can imagine, because what I regard as brilliant is very much benchmarked by my map of the world. But the more that people start to understand about themselves, the more that people start to understand about how critical communication is, the less organisations start to sheep dip, give just one size fits all type communication, the more effective the communication. Now, when effective communication happens, when self-awareness happens, when people start to get each other's thinking preferences, they start to understand where may assumptions be made, when they're good at asking open questions, when they're good at listening, then a bit of magic occurs. We end up starting to get trust of everybody because nobody's running their own agenda because they don't need to, because now they're listening to each other and they're trusting each other. What happens is you get high-performing teams. And when high performance comes, you get high performing results. People stop worrying about money. They stop worrying about targets because they almost become just second nature. What drives them is that ability to know how to get the best out of everybody. Now, many organizations only focus on IT or software systems or back office systems, or they focus on process re-engineering or decentralizing or centralizing. I'm old enough to say that I have seen them all cycle through more than once. Without engaging the people, without getting the communication right, it doesn't really make that much difference. Sure, you might see a peak, but you think about change and communication. When change in the business environment is not communicated well, you can put your whole workforce under stress. You can disengage your whole workforce. Now, we know from an engagement perspective that if you've got a really engaged person, for every hour they spend at work, you're going to get an hour and a half's productivity from them. When you've got a disengaged team who are afraid of change, then you're lucky to get 30 minutes productivity from them. So at that point in time, you really need 3 times as many people to do the work. Now, how do we stop disengagement? Communication is the first step on that road. And if we really care about our staff and we really want things to work effectively, we need to put some effort into communication. We can't just make assumptions. The old ways don't work, and we need to practice being more present. And then we need to wrap with some of those other core skills. But the magic, when you work with a high-performing team where the communication is open and transparent, which means sometimes I can't tell you everything, but I'll honestly tell you, I'm sorry, I can't tell you that right now. Now, you'll know it. It feels, looks, performs, delivers differently from the norm, and it really is worth the investment. And it's where business needs to head if it's going to make that step change, rather than just keep doing more and more of the same and keep driving more and more stress. You see, the thing about humans, the thing that we really need to understand is that actually we are made perfectly. The human brain, and that's what drives everything, not the human body. The human brain is absolutely designed for success, if only we allowed it to be. And that the mind works only one way, from inside to outside. It's all driven from thinking. And we get lost in that. We get lost in ego. We get lost in wanting to blame others. We just don't understand that we live in an inside-out world. And therefore, we're continuously looking in the wrong place. We're never quite looking in the area that we need to look in to get the right answer. If we then disregard preferences, if we then don't notice whether people are under stress or not, if we then don't notice how people are impacted by change, we know what happens. Accidents go up, disengagement goes up, people do stupid things that they wouldn't normally do. How many times have you had a situation where somebody has just done something that is just so ridiculous, and you think, why did they do that? Very often we got stress behind that. Oh, I needed to get it done really quickly because otherwise my boss, and the story runs in their head, not based on reality, but in that inside out world. And we just need to understand that about people. We need to understand ourselves first, though, because we need to earn the right. If we don't understand ourselves, we don't stand a chance of being able to understand anybody else. And once we start to understand others, then actually we owe it to us and them to take that into account when we're communicating with them. We owe it to us and them to stay present and in the moment and keep that chatterbox in our head to silence where possible, but certainly minimized, and not allowing it to just take over our world so that we tell those stories out. Are there any other questions before we move to what are we going to do about all this then?
There's a couple more questions. There's a couple that are more related to written communication, but I think that you wanted to leave that until a bit nearer the end. We've got one more that's relates back to multicultural workforces.
Okay.
And the question is basically, what is the most effective way to communicate with a multicultural workforce? Should communication be adapted to various national cultures, and in which way?
So we need to be very careful when we're communicating with people, regardless of culture, that they understand the message. Otherwise, the communication is really pointless. And I would go back to, when we're thinking about communicating, we need to think about, have we covered the what, why, and the facts and the feelings? Because otherwise, the positive intention, I'm going to assume, that was coming from the communication is not necessarily going to align. And when we start ourselves, aiming for trouble right from the very beginning. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at our communication, we've got our what, why, facts and feelings. And that when we're doing communication, we're not communicating from our preference, which is what tends to happen. I hold my pen in my right hand. I prefer to think in this way, and therefore I'm going to communicate in that way, assuming that that works for everybody else. But as you saw from my very different maps of the world, it's not about me. Communication is not all about me, the communicator. I have to pay attention to my audience. I have to make sure that I have got enough facts there, that I have got enough detail there, that I have enough engagement with the people in the room, where engagement and empathy is really important, and that I have some freedom. Otherwise, I'm going to disengage part of the room. And when we look across the world, we know that roughly, regardless of culture, regardless of those old stereotypes, we split about 25% in each quadrant. So therefore, if we don't take that into account, we risk alienating 25, 50, 75% of our audiences. And if we're only communicating in our preferred style, whether that be verbal or written, and we're only communicating when it suits us rather than the recipients, and if we're only communicating the what, not the why, not the facts and the feelings, then why on earth would we be surprised when the communication doesn't work or people start to get disengaged? And when we have that process in train, then people stop reading us or they stop listening to us. But you know what? It's pretty tough to tell sometimes. Because when we're about 4 or 5, we learn a face that I like to call the look to listen face. The one that when someone in command, so parent or teacher or club leader, shouts at you and uses that kind of raised up body language, we listen and we give them full eye contact. And very quickly, by the time we're about 5, we learn they don't control our brains. And as long as I give them that very innocent, wide-eyed, look to listen face, and I nod occasionally to look as though I am listening, I can fool the communicator into thinking I'm fully engaged. Why would I be fully engaged if you're speaking to me in the wrong thinking preference? It would be like speaking in Chinese to me when I'm English and I don't understand Chinese at all. And you're just wholly reliant on me getting something from the tone. Why would we do that? So we do need to stop and think about this communication a little bit more, because communication is where it all starts. It's not IT, it's not process, it's communication. It's where it starts and where it ends very often. And ending can be super successful, or it can be really painful, right to the point of conflict and blame. And interestingly enough, when we see egos out to play, when we see people that are coming across as aggressive or super defensive or any of those human traits that perhaps are not quite so attractive, then rather than thinking this is something I need to respond to in type, if we at least understand that all we are seeing is that person is a little bit insecure at that point in time. And coming from that little bit insecure, a little bit stressed, if we then approach it in a way that is going to align to them, we can take that out of the communication. We don't have to go there. What makes us go there normally is that we join them in their stress, because we tell ourselves a story about that ego, that aggression, that defensiveness. We make it up and we just don't check, unfortunately. So it is about, it's not getting tied in culture, it's not getting tied in language. What, why, facts and feelings, and am I communicating with all parts of the brain, all preferences in the brain, or am I just doing it from my preference? Because I don't have to listen to me, but it's the others that I want to listen. Are there any other questions that you think would be good right now?
Possibly. I'm just reading another one that has just come in. We have legal duties for consultation on change that affects the workforce. How would you suggest we verify that this critical process is effective?
Well, feedback for a start is the easy one. You know, when we're communicating change, particularly where there's legal elements to it, then we need to do that check-in. We need to go back to our questioning and listening and make sure that they really understand it. And rather than just asking those closed questions, it may well be that we ask them to let them tell us their understanding of whatever it is that we're communicating. Now, that may heavy up the front end of the communication process slightly. So it may mean that we have slightly deeper conversations. But we know when we're asking people questions that we've got to the bottom of all the information or all of the concerns they have when they start repeating themselves. It's a bit like walking down the stairs. You know, when you get to the bottom and there's nowhere else to go, you start walking back up again. So when we start asking people questions and we're getting repeated answers, we then know that we've got all of the information out. But also there is a tendency that when we have something that is legally required to be communicated, we get tied up in very blue A type communication, which is where all the facts and the data come from. And we just ignore the rest of it. We may get a little bit of green communication and detail slipping in there. And what are the chances of people that have a red or yellow thinking preference engaging with that and really understanding it? We need to make sure that, of course, we are compliant and that, of course, we are in line with the law. But that does not mean to say that we cannot communicate in a way that's effective for the whole world. We just need to do it in a slightly different way from the way we've always done it. Same old doesn't cut it. And in fact, when we start to look at some of the preferences, if we just look at thinking preferences just for a second, people have expectations. What are they looking for? So in that green quadrant, when we're talking about legal communication, for example, they may well be expecting something in writing that's 3 or 4 pages long. If you give that to somebody who has got a strong blue quadrant, who's looking for precision and looking for accuracy, they may skim read the first paragraph and then determine that it's not appropriate for them and not read the rest. In that yellow quadrant, they may not even get to read it if there's no pictures and colour in there. They may just determine that, you know what, I'll read it later. And in that red quadrant, if it feels as though it's something that isn't taking other people into account, where empathy and impact on others is just not evident, then you start mistrust. So I appreciate this stuff has to happen. Of course it does. But it's about how we make it happen. Are we appealing to everybody? Are we just doing what we've always done and then expecting a different result? Are there any others?
So the remaining questions we've got at the moment are again related back to written communications.
Mm-hmm.
There's one here which admittedly I think I am very much guilty of doing and waffling a little bit too much, but what is the ideal length of written communication? So, you know, at what point is it too much that you're using and the content relevance is becoming irrelevant almost?
Okay, and what we're hearing there is that, you know, we all have labels and rules, and very often we just get in our own way because we make some kind of assumption rather than checking in. And it might mean that we need to experiment and establish exactly what's going to work. But if we, when we're doing a communication, we make sure that there is enough blue what in there, enough yellow why, enough red who, and enough green how, then we know that we are going to be engaging with all 4 of them. And therein after, communication is two-way. It isn't let me just pour communication at you and hope that it lands, because we're not hopers. And if we are hopers, then we are not in control. We're not in control of anything, never mind health and safety. We're just kind of hoping it'll stick. We need to get into the habit of covering what, why, who, and how. We need to make sure that people understand all of the facts, that we take into account their feelings, and therefore when we are communicating written or verbal, we get used to checking in And that means it has to be okay to feedback. And that means it has to be of an environment where trust is okay and it's okay to make mistakes, because we're not perfect, we're human beings. We can't be perfect. And if we embark on that learning approach from a communication perspective, where we really start to understand the differences, understand that, you know, it's not about right and wrong, it's that we all have a unique brain, and therefore we are all living in a unique bubble. How I see the world is different from anybody else in the world. And when we start to assume or presume that actually what I'm saying you really understand and you're perceiving it in exactly the same way as I'm perceiving it, and that's all I have to do is turn up and do what I always do in the way that is most comfortable for me, the only person I'm kidding is myself. Because when we're talking about communication, not only do we have to think about that, but we really have to understand that we are all different on the inside and on the outside. But regardless of those differences, it really all starts with a thought. And as we begin to close out, I have just got a very close eye on the time here. Could we just close out with another couple of questions, perhaps, Ben?
Yeah, of course. One actually relates back to the model on the previous slide.
Yeah.
When running training with a large group of people, how can we ensure that we engage with all quads of the model?
And that's really important. So the whole brain thinking model was originally designed with training in mind to make sure that we had enough engagement with all of the four quadrants, because otherwise we end up with people only hearing what they think is relevant to them. And even then, we're not sure if they hear it cleanly. So it is about designing the training in the first instance to make sure that there are enough facts and data there, that there is enough detail there, that there is enough interpersonal, experiential, kinesthetic feeling, experimental type learning, and enough freedom to explore the what if. And if we start to cut out any of that, and we just go for a traditional education, let's get you in the classroom, now let me pour information at you, even though I may allow a few questions, we're never going to get the results we want, because we've just alienated 50% of the audience potentially. You know, it's why we struggle in the education system so much, because the education system in the UK and most of the Western world runs up that green-blue quadrant side. Well, you know what? Kids have thinking preferences too, as well as adults. And therefore, if we want them to learn something that we want them to keep, something that is life critical, we need to make sure we can communicate that learning in a way. We can't teach. We can only hope to get people to understand.
Okay, great. I think we'll finish off with one more. We've probably got time for this one. It's more actually a statement, I suppose. But having worked with Koreans for 5 years and other nationalities, understanding culture is critical to communication. To delivery is key. For example, save face. Otherwise, failure is assured. Western approach will not work well.
So for sure, we need to understand if there are some local rules, then for sure we need to understand those, and out of respect for the person that we're communicating with, then we need to gather that. But at the same time, whether we're talking about Korean, German, South American, and I routinely work with all of these people, then the whole brain thinking model, where people's preferences are, understanding that it all starts with a thought, making sure that I do the what, why, facts and feelings, is applicable regardless of where people come from. We get so tied up with this culture stuff that we overlook the fact that we're all human beings. And actually, if you take the skin off of all of us, we're all pretty much the same on the inside. And for all of us, regardless of culture, regardless of local customs, it all starts with a thought. And that's really where we need to start. When we're communicating, start with thinking about others and where their preferences may be, so that we land it in a way that engages them and they really hear what we want to say. So, should we just have one last question, Ben? Do we have time for one last question? I'm very now become very green and very time aware.
Yeah, we'll just have this last question, which I think is actually a very good closer, and that is simply, what can we do to have the best chance of communicating effectively?
Take the time to think about the people that you're communicating with. rather than take the time to think about what you're communicating. Most of the time we think about what is the message we want to get across, rather than what is it that the message that the people are going to hear. What approach do I need to take? Why do I need to take that approach? Do I need to just do one newsletter or one email or one memo? Or do I actually need to do a combination of approaches so that I can be sure I hit all of the different needs for communication? And then I need to check in. I need to check in that it landed and that my communication was effective. And if it wasn't, then I need to learn from that. Because without that feedback, we just do what we've always done and we're always going to get the same response. So I hope that was helpful to everybody. And thank you very much. Thank you, Ben.
Excellent. Okay, well, that's brilliant. That's a fantastic session. I hope you all enjoyed it. We are going to close at that point. I'm just going to launch a quick poll. I would be really grateful if you wouldn't mind just quickly answering the 4 questions that should have popped up on your screen, just for feedback purposes, really. Again, thank you very much, Sue, for coming in and delivering that session. What I thought was a very interactive and very informative session. Thank you all, obviously, for attending and for your questions. This session has been recorded and it will be made available, so you will all receive an email from me shortly, providing you with the details of that, so you can play this back at a later stage. Again, if you do have any further comments, you can email me back once you've received the email. Other than that, all that's left for me to say really is, again, thank you very much to Sue. I'm going to leave the webinar open just for just for another minute, just to allow for any final polls to come through. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you very much.
Thank you.